Okay, good morning, everyone, and welcome to Plenary Session 4, which will be looking at facing the fourth industrial revolution, which way for Africa? My name is Raymond Gilpin. I'm Chief Economist at the Regional Bureau for Africa for UNDP. It's a pleasure to have all of you here, and a special welcome to all of you joining us remotely. Welcome, and please feel free to use the chat box to share your questions, comments, opinions, post links to documents and articles that you think might be relevant. And during the discussion time, we'll be more than happy to hear from some of you and have you interact with our panel. And for all of you joining us remotely and those of you here in person, I'd like to encourage you to share this event and this session on social media, tweet #2030AEC. But I'm really happy that we are here talking about the fourth industrial revolution. But let us start with some definitions, because I have read a number of papers, and some of them seem to be using fourth industrial revolution and industrial revolution in Africa interchangeably. The fourth industrial revolution is not exclusively about industrialization in Africa. It is about how changes in the use of technology could disrupt, could revitalize, and also could cause exponential growth. Those of you who are historians would remember that the first industrial revolution happened when steam and coal became part of production. When we had hydrocarbons and electricity, we had the second industrial revolution. The third industrial revolution was all about automation and machinery. And now we're at the cusp of something new, where intelligent computers and green energy transitions are shaping the way we not only do business, but also the way we live and interact. We're looking at things like artificial intelligence, augmented reality, robotics, 3D printing, blockchain, just to name a few. But today's discussion, we want to frame it around how we understand this change that machine learning, intelligent computers, and green transitions would have for the African continent. A lot of what we know about this topic comes from the 2016 World Economic Forum and the seminal book by Klaus Schwab. And whenever we think about the fourth industrial revolution, three things come to mind: the technologies, new technologies, exponential growth, and disruptive change. So two questions are important for Africa in this regard, and particularly in the context of this year's African Economics Conference. The first is, will African countries leapfrog industrial revolutions, moving from the second, some communities are still in the first, and come to the fourth? And what are the pros and cons and implications of this? The second question that we'll be interrogating is, to what extent will the fourth industrial revolution be truly disruptive in Africa? Or would African countries be left further behind as the world moves forward at an exponential speed? There's a great book by the economist Landry Senior titled Africa's Fourth Industrial Revolution. It was released in June this year. I recommend it highly. Well, these questions and more are what we really want to explore today. And we're very, very fortunate to have a very able panel to do this. And we're going to have a discussion, not speeches and remarks, because we want to, dig deeper and delve deeper into some of these fundamental questions. We have a lot of ground to cover. We're honored to have four very capable people. First is Mavis Owusu-Gyamfi, Executive Vice President of the Africa Center for Economic Transformation in Accra, Ghana. Thank you for joining us. Joining us virtually, we have Natalie Jabangwe, who is Chief Digital Officer for Sanlam. Thank you so much for joining us, Natalie. Apologies for the hassles with the connection. We're pleased to have you here. Then we have Rita Babihuga Zanzi, Chief Economist and Director of Research and Strategy at the Africa Finance Corporation. She's also joining us virtually. And lastly, Mr. Paison Cherinet, CEO and founder of Orbit Health Co. and the Orbit Innovation Hub. But let me start with you, Mavis. Industrialization in Africa will require a fair amount of economic transformation. In your view, and from all the work that ACET has done, what strategies need to be in place to enhance prospects for economic transformation across Africa? And what role can technology play?
Raymond. Thank you very much, and good morning, everyone. So at Asset, we believe very strongly that African economies cannot just grow, they must transform. We've seen a lot of growth over the last couple of decades. And if we are honest, this growth has not really benefited ordinary people. Okay, so we really need to transform in a way that put people's well-being at the heart of everything we do. And we have a recipe for transformation, and it's called growth with depth, not debt, depth, D-E-P-T-H. And it's the type of growth that drives diversification of our economies, enhances export competitiveness, improves productivity, effectively uses technology, something we are discussing today, and contributes to human well-being. So if we don't grow with depth, then we will struggle. And as I said, you know, to be very biased, we would like every African country to use the depth framework to test whether or not they are transforming as a country. A couple of weeks ago, we launched our latest Africa Transformation Index. It covers 30 countries, not all 54 because we don't have the data in the other 24, but we have 30. But those 30 represent 86.5% of the continent's GDP. So it's a substantive part of what we represent as a continent. Unfortunately, our results overall show that we are regressing in transformation. We are actually not improving. If the data looked from 2000 to 2020, from 2000 to 2010, we were progressing slowly. From 2010 to 2020, and remember this was before COVID, we were regressing. So imagine what COVID has done to the continent right now. And there were two things that really were affecting us. One was low labor productivity, especially due to low skills level. So there's a mismatch between our skills and our education systems and what companies that are growing our economies need. The second one that we also discovered was that our export competitiveness is largely concentrated in primary commodities. In fact, our top 5 export products on the continent constitute between 70 to 80% of our total export volumes. And sadly, in some countries, including my own beloved home, Ghana, we are getting worse. We've gone from 5 products in 2000 to 2010 to 2 products, being the largest share of our exports. So as our products have become less diversified over the past 2 decades, it shows that we are also deindustrializing. And so we tend to be importing more now than we are producing. And we like to talk about leapfrogging. And Raymond, you just said, are we going to leapfrog to the 4th industrial revolution? Actually, what we did was we leapfrogged from low productive agriculture to low productive services. that is not going to generate the jobs that we desperately need. So what we need to do is we need to be very intentional when we talk about building an industrial Africa, when we talk about green industries, when we talk about how do we make the fourth industrial revolution work for the continent, we need to be intentional. We need to forget this thing that we've adopted called the invisible hand of government will happen. Let's be honest, population, agglomeration did not lead to industries in Africa. Why? Well, give me a country where the invisible hand made it work. It doesn't work. I'm not saying governments must be in there, but governments would be very intentional in picking sectors. So I'm going to, if you bear with me, I know this is supposed to be a conversation, but I just want to raise a couple of things, if you bear with me. The first one is, yesterday, I was talking to a couple of gentlemen about why there's so many suits in this room, okay? And a number of them said to me, well, my suit was made in Nigeria. Although I must say, I've noticed a number of you are wearing African wear today after my comments yesterday, but that's another story. But the question is, where does the fabric for that suit come from? Okay, where? It does not. Let's be honest. The last time we looked at the numbers, Madagascar was importing from somewhere in Southeast Asia. So what we need to do is, we are sitting on a continent where the Sahel is growing cotton, which is exported to Southeast Asia. Then we buy it in East Africa and parts of West Africa to produce suits, etc., some of which are exported, some of which are kept on the continent. Then we buy the same fabric to print these things and make beautiful dresses, okay? We find a lot of our fashion designers being stolen by the big houses of Gucci, etc., because these fabrics are real. What is stopping us from having, okay, let's say we have AFCFTA and we are very proud of it. What is stopping us, seriously, from taking the cotton from the Sahel, producing it in Ghana, shipping it to East Africa and West Africa to be shipped out of the world, and building a fantastic clothing industry, high-end, in West Africa? Nothing, except our inability to look beyond our borders. So unless we start to look at our industrialization as regional value chains and centers of expertise, we will be sitting here a bit older and having the same conversation. So we have a few things, and I know you're going to stop me, but I would like to come back to one thing: human capital. Let's rethink TVET, okay? The fourth industrial revolution requires us to rethink TVET. It requires how to rethink AI. And there's a lot of work being done where technology is an opportunity, not a threat. I haven't finished, but I'll come back to it in the Q&A.
Thank you so much, Mavis. I think this is a great start. You talked about the data that shows some regression. You also unpacked the need and the centrality for some economic transformation to be part of the equation if we're even going to think about making some progress, let alone leapfrogging anywhere. And then I liked at the end, you talked about regional value chains. So last year, UNDP published a report that looked at which value chains make most sense for a Made in Africa revolution. I think that's where we need to start. And I think it's a good segue for us to go to Natalie. Natalie, you are a leading entrepreneur. You've got firm roots in Africa's private sector. You've heard what Mavis has shared. From your perspective and in your experience, what practical steps could African countries take to create and sustain the sort of enabling framework needed for Africa's emerging industrialists?
Thanks very much indeed. I appreciate being able to be facilitated virtually onto this panel this morning. I hope that you can hear me clearly. I want to focus and maybe also just add on to what Mavis has already laid the foundation for. I think to be able to move to a more industrialized Africa, and for us to be able to reverse the burden of low skills that we're facing on the African continent, it's imperative for us, in my perspective, and given my experience across the African continent, but also speaking as a young person, to focus on 5 things. We are far behind in Africa on our drive for growing a middle income. We have a massive gap between the lower income and the higher income. It means that the median age of the populace that should actually be growing and working for economies, which is between the ages of about 23 to the ages of about 33, are not skilled and they don't have jobs. So the second thing is that we need to create work. And I'm not sure that the answer is actually we need to create jobs, but we need on this continent to be able to create meaningful work. And the meaningful work that we have to be able to create on this continent should attract highly talented and developed human skills. And this, by the way, should include the creative industries. And I'll come back to the creative industries during this conversation I'm having. But what kind of work drives an industrialized economy? What kind of work should we really be creating? Africa is well known from 2010 through the McKinsey report to be creating the adage of the Africa Rising, which we know nobody talks about anymore. We're talking about the reversal gains of Africa Rising. And I think the problem with the kind of works and the jobs that Africa is creating is they remain highly informal. It's not a bad thing, but it means that we don't get the multiplier effect for scale. It means that we don't get the quality of service that is required to make us globally competitive. So number 3, Africa needs to focus on creating work through sustainable and world-class platforms. When we start talking about platforms, this leads us into the Industrial Revolution and particularly the tech age. If we look, for example, and I'm not sure that this might be a perfectly good example, but I think it's a relevant example, South Korea, about 30 years ago, and where their economy was. They really started working on platforms of work. We saw the advent of Samsung. We saw the advent of LG. They took intent as a country to create platforms and meaningful works. Many of us in our hands today probably hold a Samsung phone, or in our houses a Samsung television device and or an LG one. These are platforms today that are used as the modus for communication and or even for advertising. And when we talk platforms, we're also talking about telecommunications. And we have seen how telecommunications firms in Africa have driven growth through mobile money operations, as an example, through the distribution of data and airtime, and just driving connectivity. So we have a degree and a level of platforms, but that in itself is not enough. We have to take a look at what China is doing, whether or not we like that example, but the ability to create technological platforms that are driving scale globally results in the ability to create meaningful work and to drive a middle-income economy. Notwithstanding, of course, the example that we have seen for a lifetime, how the US has been able to create continuous cycle of platforms to drive a middle income and meaningful work. But platforms alone are not enough. We have to think about, well, how are we going to finance the actors that are coming into those platforms? And how are we going to finance the infrastructure that we're talking about? So financing becomes a fundamental conversation. And I know that the various platforms that have been championed by the African Union, I know that we have the flagship Timbuktu project that's being worked out of the UNDP. Those are fabulous. And we should accelerate them to ensure that we are driving financing to create work and human skills development to drive a middle income. But it goes without saying that for Africa, what will really make this a fundamental foundation for scale, we need to have cross-border trade. And so I'd like to appreciate the recent moves by the government of Rwanda, also by the governments of Kenya, and lately the visa opening between South Africa and Ghana. All of those are hallmarks of progress that we should continue to see. I will stop here for a while, but maybe finally, before we hand it over to other panelists, the 2023 Investment Promotions Agency report on innovation says that 81% of investment promotion agencies globally are looking for investments in digital and infrastructure. And these are some of the best in the world who are driving middle-income economies. I think that should give us some nuances and norms as to where we need to focus on in Africa. 45% are looking at energy. And again, that speaks to the notion of infrastructure that we're talking about, which are critical success factors to driving middle-income industrialized continent. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Natalie, for those 5 points. And I think we are, like slowly edging to, some of the very, very important issues around what this fourth industrial revolution is likely to mean for Africa. You talked about the low skills issue. Again, it's a low value addition thing seems to be the proverbial albatross around our necks. I like your distinction between just thinking about jobs to meaningful work, creating the platforms. And you also talked about regional integration. I think your 5th point was about financing. I think this is where we'll move over to you, Rita. And Rita, you are with one of Africa's leading financing institutions. And most people have said that industrialization in Africa is going to need patient capital and lots of it. It's also going to need capital that could meet the African entrepreneurs where they are. Most of them are small and medium scale in nature. From your perspective, how might African countries and African institutions go about this? And what innovations and instruments are being developed that you can share with us that are particularly helpful in this regard?
Thank you, Raymond. Good morning, everyone. It's great to be here. And I just want to say that in terms of what's been said by my fellow panelists, Natalie and Mavis, I really couldn't agree more. On the sort of the point of capital and how we're going to finance this kind of huge requirement in a context where most countries are actually regressing. You used the word regression, Mavis, and I couldn't agree more, because if you take, I'm just going to throw in another data point, and that is the manufacturing value add. If you look at just the manufacturing value add across the continent, it really paints a picture of deindustrialization from where this continent was 40 years ago. Right, so we know that in the early 80s, manufacturing value add as a share of GDP was somewhere around 18%. That declined very steadily and has troughed at less than 10% of GDP in 2011. Now, since then, there's been a slight improvement, but the bulk of countries, with the exception of maybe 4 or 5 or 6, Benin, Ethiopia, Nigeria, Togo, the bulk of countries show a very steady reduction in the pace of growth of manufacturing value add to GDP. And the reasons for this trend have to do with a lot to do with the lack of capital, Raymond, which is sort of the topic of my section. But there are other reasons as well that are kind of well known and well understood. The lack of infrastructure, most importantly energy, the lack of intentionality. Mavis made the point about intentionality, and I couldn't agree more. This lack of intentionality is sort of reflected in the types of choices that countries are making around industrial policy. So there's a real desire, I would say, and you know, over the last, I'd say maybe 10 years, you've seen increasingly countries start to talk about they need to industrialize, but the how and how to do this, the model that will drive success is just not proven. So I'll circle back to the capital point, Raymond, but I just want to share a little bit of AFC's, the Africa Finance Corporation's experience in this area, because it's a question that we struggle with. It's really at the heart of our mandate, where infrastructure, where we were set up to drive infrastructure development across the continent with the objective of eventually, essentially, allowing for industrial development and structural transformation across countries. And so what we have sort of experimented with is a potential model for industrial development that's focused on special economic zones, but special economic zones done in a very particular way, because we think that that can provide an avenue to bypass all of the infrastructure challenges that typically exist in a country, and to some extent, the policy and regulatory challenges where they do pose a constraint. And from our experience at AFC as an anchor investor in the Arise industrial platforms, which has really been the pilot of how to drive industrial development in a particular country, we've seen firsthand the critical role that these special economic zones can play, because they serve as oases of excellence and can help in turning a country's industrial sector around. So what are the key learnings? First of all, we think that the industrial process in a country needs to be centered around the country's raw materials, right? And needs to be focused on developing a local value chain around, you know, whatever the product is, whether it's cotton, whether it's cocoa, whether it's timber. And just reflecting on the point that Mavis was making, eventually, I think this also needs to be regional in nature, right? Where we're sort of taking advantage of economies of scale, because a lot of times you have a group of countries within a particular region that produce the same raw material. And it really makes sense to then identify a particular country in that region to be maybe the center of production, where we're pooling all of the raw materials into one industrial base and sort of really leveraging each country's unique characteristics and strengths, but also then focusing on the kind of the logistics setup. So, which takes me back to the special economic zones, and what AFC has seen is that you have to be invested in the ecosystem of infrastructure around the development of a value chain, right? So that means the roads, the railways, sort of the logistics that are going to evacuate your finished goods to market, but you have to be very, very kind of detailed and intentional about the entire value chain. This inevitably requires the partnership of governments, and you know, in our special economic zones. So the pilot is in Benin, where we developed a value chain around, Gabon, value chain around the timber industry. The government was extremely crucial in setting up in kind of setting out. So they're part of the partnership for this project, right? They're an equal partner. And what they did that was really catalytic was that they, number one, banned the export of the raw material, in this case raw logs, and created sort of a structure where the raw material could come into the economic zone and be processed from end to end. Every bit of that log is used by all of the producers in the economic zone, and they speak to each other. They input into each other's sort of production processes. But here, the point around PPPs, because AFC is essentially a PPP. We have the shareholding of the private sector. Our activities are very sort of private sector driven, but we also have the participation of governments. And I think that's really, really key in the case of Africa. I'll mention the last point in terms of what it takes to make this a success. So number one, centralizing around the raw material. Number two, the partnership with governments. And third is the provision of reliable, cheap utility services. So industrialization is extremely expensive. You have to have the full gamut of infrastructure and logistical services necessary to kind of create that value chain around a product, which then takes me back to the point about capital, because I think this has really been the key constraint for many countries. And in our experience, where we've done this project, again, the pilot in Gabon, now expanding to several other countries, Benin around cotton, and the other countries around their specific natural resource, we find that the capital needs can be very significant. The returns, because this industrial development and infrastructure development projects are multi-year opportunities for which the returns do not necessarily accrue in the first few years. It is so important that you have patient capital, investors that are aligned with the long-term development imperative of the project and of the country. And I would love to give you lots of, brilliant ideas about where those types of investors might come from. But I think the very simple answer to the question of where does patient capital come from is that it comes from home, right? Domestic capital is really the definition of patient capital. And within Africa, there is an estimated maybe $2 trillion in assets under management of domestic institutional investors. So these are pension funds, sovereign wealth funds, and this isn't even to include the reserves of institutions across the continent. But my sense is that there is a lot of untapped capital on the continent, which a lot of times in our analysis tends to, has all of these investment mandates that require pension funds to invest outside of the continent. And so why don't we set up a system where maybe some of those mandates can be refocused to still achieve the diversity sort of premium, but do that regionally in other parts of Africa. And I think here is where the South African pension industry has really kind of departed from the rest of the continent and is actively looking for opportunities for investment and diversification across the continent.
Okay,
I will
thank
say
you.
that the reason local domestic. Can I just make a final point before you move me on, Raymond? I'm so sorry.
I do apologize because we are running out of time, but yes, a final point from you. Okay,
sure. So the final point about why domestic capital is so important in the development, in industrialization, is because of the local currency component of it, which sort of mitigates against currency devaluation risk, which tends to be one of the biggest risks around infrastructure and industrial development. Thank you.
No, thank you so much. I do apologize for interrupting, but I want to make sure that we could hear from all of you, our panelists, and then engage our audience, both our in-person audience and those online as well. You've raised a number of very interesting issues. I really like how you defined patient capital, because that's a conversation we keep hearing over and over again. Where could Africa find this capital? And I think what you said and what the data shows is that Africa actually does own this capital, but is not utilizing it as well as it should. But Pazion, you are a CEO of a leading innovation hub, and you yourself have started a few startups across the African continent. From a practitioner's perspective, what opportunities do you see for rapid and inclusive industrialization in Africa?
Thank you very much, Raymond, and all the panelists. They have brought very, very critical and important points that would sort of allow the continent to leverage from the fourth industrial revolution. This morning, I called a ride. It's kind of an Uber type of service. So I saw him in the map. I normally use my app, and normally here in Ethiopia, they call you. They'll ask you, where are you? And I always ask them, do you use the map? The map doesn't work. I know it does work. Okay, so I would look into the map and I'll help them navigate to get to my house. We could not communicate enough, so I had to cancel and then call another one. Imagine the guy's using the latest technology on his hand. He has a job. There's a company called Ride that opened up opportunities. Obviously, that's how he earns money. But what really lacks is not availability or accessibility, but the lack of immersion. And then you talked about depth. And without immersion, I don't think how we could personalize and leverage these advanced technologies. I was just in Kenya yesterday, and I was in Rwanda, South Africa these last few weeks. One thing that really hit me, in Kenya, you go to a high-end neighborhood or low, it doesn't matter. The lady that sells potato, tomato, or what have you on the street, they all use M-Pesa. For me, they've personalized the ability to utilize whatever that's available, but at the same time run with it. So our innovation hub, what we always encourage is sometimes look around what's available, accessible. What can you do with it? So as Africans, we are very good at running marathon, Ethiopia, Kenya, what have you. But when you look into the 4x4 relay, so normally they put the fastest person at last. Have you noticed that? So he's sort of get ready to sprint the last mile. So I think what we lack is if you are not able to do that, we regress. So we start asking, how do we get there? So out of the main components of the fourth industrial revolution, particularly in sustainability, the social equity and technology innovation dimensions are critical, because without investing on a skill, without investing on not just training people and just sprinkling them with water and anticipating that they know how to swim, which is completely a different skill set and experience, but rather we focus on depth. When you look into across different countries of Africa, most of our education system is not in a good shape. And by part, we're still using the old approach to really elevate this new generation into a new approach. And that's not working. That's not working for us. There's another dimension in this Kenya. I was in this program. It's called Bima Lab accelerator program around bringing insurance for the masses. Currently, insurance penetration rates in Ethiopia is less than 1%. And that's not, I mean, Ghana, Nigeria, Kenya, they've done a little better, but collectively it's not even more than 1%. So, but technology is available. You can buy insurance easily on your mobile phone or what have you, right? So what's lacking, and we were just brainstorming, how do we bring the majority of our population to benefit and participate the advancement of technology in a very practical manner? So I think we need to stay away from these big words, fancy words, and, ambitions and sort of wishful thinkings, but rather pick those things that are working. For example, what worked in Kenya, can we scale it regionally, continent-wide? This also brings me back to my previous experience with Boeing. I was a electromagnetic systems engineer for over a decade at Boeing. So if you guys probably have flown Ethiopian Airlines for a longer haul, you probably have flown 787. That's a Dreamliner, beautiful, beautiful airplane. I also had a part. I worked in that. What made 787 unique was the company's strategic approach to globalize what it does and leverage every other country's capability. For example, the wings of 787 are made in Japan. And Japan is one of the major customer of Boeing. In fact, ANA, Air Nippon Air, Japan Air, they bought the first 20 airplanes off the shelf. But what they've done is, it was nothing less than a miracle, because they scanned the entire globe and identify, let's say, Alania, they have an amazing technology. There's a wonderful school and they have raw material. They looked into Europe, different parts of the world. Then they negotiated. Of course, the company has to outsource knowledge, technology, but then they involve the locals to build, construct, and then the company ended up assembling all those aircrafts at the facility in Seattle and the Carolinas. So the lesson for me there is, we always talk about lack of capital. Do we really lack capital, or capital utilization, or efficient, effective utilization of capital? So one model, I'm going to wrap up. One model I noticed these last few days is, we picked Uganda, Kenya, and Ethiopia with the three companies and around the health and the digital insurance space. We are contemplating, and instead of looking for funding individually, imagine let's collectively look for a pool funding so that we will scale in 3 different countries. That's where leapfrogging can come, and then really literally help us, save us. So in summary, the 3 things I believe we should do is immersion of usage of technology, then rapid scale up by collaboration throughout the continent. And then the Africa Free Trade would have been an amazing vehicle to sort of help us advance, get there. Thank you.
Thank you so much for, I think, a lot of richness in that. I really like the Boeing example because it talked a lot about how you enhance value addition, how you expand local content, how you ensure that you scale up successes. And I think these are some of the things that are coming up in this conversation. I think now I want to open it for a few questions. If we have questions online, please let me know. We don't have a lot of time, it's only about 15 minutes. So please raise your hand and we'll get microphone to you. I think we have the first question there, second question. We'll do a third question. Looking for a hand. It's going. Okay, we'll have 2 questions to start. Fatmata, please.
Thank you very much. Good morning. My name is Fatmata, and I'm a senior economist for UNDP. I'm not going to say which country because my question is going to you, Mavis, so I don't let myself out. Ghana has been an interesting case for all over Africa, 30 years of increasing GDP growth rate. And it's been very exciting to note that, in fact, that growth rate, services has been taking a bigger share, about 45%. So it gives you some excitement that are we slowly transforming from the dependence on agriculture. So to hear from you today about low productivity in agriculture and low productivity in services was actually a dent in the aspirations that we have for Africa. Most importantly, just 2 days ago, the budget was read. And one of the key highlights on the budget for Ghana for 2024 is it is in 2024 that the country will hit $1 trillion Ghana cedis GDP growth rate, roughly about $100 billion. Now, we should be concerned, what is going to be the source of this growth rate? And how is that going to change the lives of Ghanaians? So my question to you is, why is Ghana not serving as an example for the growth in depth that other countries in Africa can actually learn from? What is holding Ghana back from doing that? My last point, please allow me to say this, is just a source of information. I'm very happy to hear from Natalie talking about human capital development, going beyond jobs, but looking at work. It's the value of work. That's why UNDP in Ghana, we're working on a national human development report that is looking at the value of work. Let's not talk about jobs, unemployment, and employment, but let's look at the various work and the future value of work and how that changes human development. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Fatmata. You actually managed to disclose the country, but
I like this UNDP institution. Do you have jobs? Just 3 issues. Fantastic discussion. The first one around infrastructure, I think you're absolutely right. Here is my problem. Whether you like him or not, Cecil John Rhodes could see Cairo from Cape Town, trying to connect Africa. What has gone wrong with our leaders today? And what can we do to encourage them to see Cairo from Cape Town and unlock this continent? The second one, I think Natalie and yourselves, you make a very good point about financing. Just a contradiction that I saw there. I think that when you're talking about financing, you're thinking about big industry. Yet our Africa is at the level of startups. Is that financing directed at startups? Now, I think of people like my mother who started selling tomatoes and was doing an Uber type delivery 20 years ago, before Uber. She couldn't get financing. And there are many like my mother today. So what can we do to ensure that financing is targeted at the people who we want to graduate into the middle class? The last one, technology. Across the continent, there's a lot of government in our economy. You're absolutely right. But that government is concentrated at the top level of our economy, like an inverted triangle, if you like. At the bottom, where we need it, in agriculture, we find one extension officer for 100,000 or 10,000 farmers. How can technology help us to level this so that the one extension officer is able to have the capability to lead many?
Thank you so much, Max Gomera, UNDP resident representative in South Africa. I'll out you. Do we have any questions online? No? So let me go back to the panel. You've heard the questions, and I'd also like you, in terms of wrapping it up, again, we started by talking about these industrial revolutions that have happened in recent history and how these revolutions have reshaped the way we do business, the way we live on the planet, and what's in it for Africa with the fourth industrial revolution. Let me start with you, Rita, because in your intervention, you mentioned the need for us to rethink this model. Briefly, what are one or two things that you think need to change? And Max's question on financing, how do we meet African business where it is and not where we think it should be?
Thanks, Raymond. If I were to boil it down to two things, I think that number one, from a policy level, a decision around we are not going to export raw materials in their primary form anymore in the same way that we have done since independence, because that means that our economies have not structurally transformed. They're essentially serving the same global purpose that they did during pre-colonial times. But that's a decision that's done within a country where either the policymakers or the owners of the natural resources decide we want to do the localization here, we want to create value chains, and that has all sorts of sort of positive externalities for an economy, right? Speaking to the point about the small businesses, I think when you create this value chain around that natural resource within a country, inevitably it's going to create opportunities for all sorts of small and medium-sized enterprises and sort of, even smaller shops, right? So that kind of has many positive impacts in an economy. So that's the first point. On my second point is to do with money and capital, because obviously our problem in Africa is that we're capital scarce, and it's a very simple point to think about capital needing to come from local sources. I don't think that there are any examples globally of any region of the world that has managed to develop itself on the basis of foreign capital. Foreign capital is important, but it needs to be an addendum. It can't be the core of what is driving your development imperative. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rita, for those, I think, very important interventions. I'm not sure if Natalie is still there, if we've lost Natalie.
I am here.
Okay, Natalie, if you're here, could you maybe take a stab at the points made about the source of growth, and also why does there seem to be a dearth of visioning? Max talked about Cecil Rhodes way back then. Why aren't we seeing those opportunities today from a private sector perspective? I'm going to ask you to be very brief as well, because we're rounding up. Over to you, Natalie.
So maybe on visioning, I had the privilege yesterday to be in a women's conversation with Michelle Obama and Mama Graça Machel, and I think one of the things I took out from Mama Graça Machel was that it seems that the generation that is sitting in the corridors of power in Africa today are not doing enough to listen to the generation that will build the future of tomorrow. Marx talked about Cecil John Rhodes. I mean, he was literally in his 30s when he was dreaming Cape to Cairo. Where are the 20-year-olds, the 30-year-olds in the corridors of power who will see our tomorrow, whose dreams and visions we can enable in these conversations that we're having? And I think young people already. We were particularly having a conversation around women and how women should be a good custodians of the economy, not only good custodians of the economy, but they bring a different lens of diversity in leadership and in productivity. But how today Africa lags behind on educating the girl child, and we're still battling with issues around child marriage. But if you speak to a young woman on the street, she has a vision about where she wants to go, what she wants to do tomorrow. The young people are ready. They need us to be able to help them. But maybe let me switch to technology quickly. Marx talked about how do we scale, sort of like from field to fork. Smart agriculture is something Africa needs to really start prioritizing quickly. Do we need to have, again, we were talking about meaningful work. Do we need to have bodies doing the work? Do we need to have a farm agri-tech worker on the farm field, or do we actually need to provide the tools, the digitization for smart agriculture with people that are sitting on the back and actually manning the fields virtually and creating smart work and meaningful work for young people that actually could be helping productivity? So those are some things to think about.
Thank you so much, Natalie. Bazion, I'm going to appeal for brevity. What's your take on the questions you've heard? And in rounding up, what do you think needs to be done?
I think the Estonia model charts the course, because right now you can live anywhere in the world, but you can actually get a business license in less than 10, 15 minutes. And you can also be a resident of Estonia. So what they've done is can be adapted as a model where the government, in collaboration with innovators, private sectors, putting the right investment, but at the same time opening up its door for opportunities start flooding in. And that in return will elevate that single country. And then I think in Africa, I don't see anything miraculous, but rather learn, adapt it, and contextualize it, but focus on looking beyond your individual borders and boundaries. That's what technology ushering to us.
Thank you so much. Mavis, you have the last, final, and brief word.
Okay, so just very quickly on the question of Ghana, and I think everywhere else, for me, the biggest challenge we have is lack of policy coordination and implementation. We have too many policies in silos. So in most countries, when you go, you will see 3 different ministries working on the same policies. They are not connected. And then to make things work, we don't have human capital, industrial policy, growth policy, all of these are separate. They can't afford to be separate. Capital, human capital, it all has to be part of one policy. And then they have to be implemented. And finally, I have to say this, continuity, coordination and continuity. Too many, our election cycles and our fiscal populism as a continent and lack of continuity is costing us far too much. And it's time for us to stop it. So if we do absolutely nothing, let's coordinate our policies, let's implement them, and let's finish what we've started, irrespective of who is in power. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Ladies and gentlemen, join me in thanking an excellent panel.